Hi students, in this video I explain the units of analysis 10 through 15. Hopefully I'll make it all the way through 15. Moving on to number 10, motives. This is also a classical rhetorical term, and it means why do people do rhetoric? But for our case, why are these ELL writers in our class? What are their reasons? Often their reasons are they want to exceed at the U.S. university, or they want to succeed in the U.S. workplace, or they want to just work better with people in their own families or in their own communities. So there are many reasons why they write in the class, and often these reasons for English language learners are more dramatic and more powerful, more compelling. Often there's an extreme amount of pressure for English language learners to improve their English. And this pressure is felt back home. It's because their family or parents are supporting them, or it's here locally, or sometimes, for example, with some of our Generation 1-5 students, their parents, many parents want their Spanish speaking children to learn English, or sometimes their parents don't. It just depends on the situation. So make sure that you understand the motives and reasons for your English language learners, and they're going to vary. But having a good understanding of this will help you approach them individually. One of the things to look at in the readings is that do the readings assume that the students come to the class with the same motives that L1 students come to. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. Now, number 11 is what I call L2 development theory and practice. This is why I love this field so much. And this asks the question, does the assignment or curriculum assume that these are L2 people writing, or just does it assume an L1? And one of the basic conflations, there are two basic conflations with second language theory is, first, if we're teaching English language learners, we need to treat them as children because they sound like children, which isn't true, but for those uninformed, they believe that their English language learners are like children, so if they only slow it down and speak in terms that are simple, that the students will understand. Well, there's a huge difference between an adult who's learning a second language, fully literate in his or her first language, and a child who's a native English speaker of English. So there's a whole range of theory about what it means to develop competency in the second language. And there's a critical period hypothesis, which means after puberty generally you won't have a native accent. There's a transfer hypothesis we talked about. The neuroplasticity means, does the language hard code your brain, or can it change? And then there's an interesting concept called fossilization. Is English language learners tend to plateau and never get beyond the plateau. And this happens in the native language writing, but it is more common in L2. So there's a whole breadth of L2 development theory that we're going to get at, and it is mostly different than L1 theory. We're going to look at Krashen's input theory in terms of how do you best learn a second language. Do you immerse? Do you give consistent input that leads, authentic input that leads to great output? Can you learn it out of context? The zones of proximal development. So this is one of the rich areas, and this is why we're introducing the first part of the course with L2 theory. But specifically, if we, for example, will look at a compositionist who's not well versed in L2 acquisition theory, and that compositionist claims to be writing an article or exploring ELL writers and is not familiar with the terms, and we can call them out on that. Next is intercultural inquiry, ideology, and ethnocentrism. As you can tell from this course, I take a social approach to rhetoric, an intercultural approach to rhetoric, which means that, and you see this in Berlin, that our writing theory has a cultural base. And if we present something such as clarity, coherence, directness, good writing as natural, we are hiding the cultural foundations of the writing. And that becomes an ideological move because, for example, if we posit that the best way to write a paper is to argue a point with a very explicit thesis statement, we are imposing the ideology of individualism, of universalism, and specific orientation. And these are terms coming from intercultural rhetoric. But we need to be really careful, of course, about assuming things are natural or assuming things are better. We simply say this is the base. This is why we're writing or expecting you to write this way in the United States. And then we help the students transition. And this goes back to Severino's article. We don't ask them to mimic. We ask them to adapt. And so the paper feels like it's a student learning to work in the U.S. cultural context, but the student's coming from another background. That, to me, is the best approach to ideology. And we do this openly. And I don't take the position that if a student writes like an American, the student is taking on all of the American forms of consciousness. I don't take that strong position. But we need to make students aware of the cultural foundations of the writing that they do, and then we tell them you can relate to this in any way that you want. Number 13. This is a big one. It's hard to capture in this class, and it comes more from intercultural rhetoric. But currently in the United States and a lot of Western theory has as its foundation what I call the local approach. And that means that every human being is different, that all cultures are unique, and that you can't compare cultures, and you can't even categorize people as being from one culture or another because everyone's unique. That is called the emic approach, and this goes back to a distinction made long ago in linguistics. Emic comes from phonemic and etic comes from phonetic. Now, the etic approach is an approach that all cultures share these common problems or these common circumstances, but the solutions to each culture are unique. In phonetics means that all cultures can make all the sounds of all the languages. It might take some practice, but if you were born with a voice box that wasn't deformed or that is like most of the population, you can make any sound in any language. That's the etic approach. But the sounds in each language mean something different, and that's a phonemic approach. And so when we look at writing assignments, when we look at exigencies, we try to develop an approach that is etic, and we have assignments based on common human problems. Common human problems, for example, are, as I mentioned in other videos, our relationships or our families, or are trying to get to school, or trying to get in a good school, or trying to perform well, or roles of development. What is the role of electricity in your community, or something like that? You need to draw from circumstances that all your students can relate to, but in their own ways. And I know this is ideologically charged, and I love getting into arguments with local-only people because they're so grounded in their local approach, they don't believe that people can share anything. But we can. And this is a long conversation, but we use the example of translation. The local approach means you can't translate anything because it's so unique to its own situation that it'll never have the same meaning in another culture. And I say, sure, but some of that meaning can be transferred with some loss and some addition in another culture. And how you transfer that meaning is an emic and etic issue. Okay, we're going to go to the last two. And these are what I call my social justice approaches. And my social justice theory and approach comes from the human capability approach. And this is an international development model that is directly responsible for developing the quality of life indicators the United Nations has been using, is now using, to measure development projects. And this directly contradicts a number of approaches in social justice that are very common. We read some of this with Severino in her first article when she talks about, is it just to force students to take on an American voice? Let's talk about that, and I'm going to use the board as an example, and this is coming from a book I'm writing. Okay, here is a brief introduction to 2 ways to conceive of social justice, especially for writing, and this is part of a book on the border. Here is what Amartya Sen would call inside or closed loop view of social justice. And you start with social justice with a statement of equality or a statement of principles. And that statement, so example 1 statement, and I fully believe, is New Mexico students are to be equal regardless of the language. But as you go through this closed loop, but New Mexico education policy requires writing in English. So immediately we have problems of equality. Curriculum and practice are designed for English speakers, so New Mexican universities materialize the inequality of Spanish speakers, most of whom are of Mexican ancestry, and then people behave according to language inequality. Those having Mexican ancestry are the least equal, and that contradicts this statement. But what a human capability approach says in this is, okay, what are you going to do about it, number 1? Number 2, are all people going to agree with this? And number 3 is, what if people contradict, or what happens? And so, but this is a really predominant approach in social justice. We start from this principle of anti-discrimination, of equality, and you go through this closed loop that shows how it isn't happening, and because it isn't happening, the inequality consists, and the inequality continues to move in this closed loop system. And here's what I write in my book, and this is just a draft, but the race and writing model grossly simplifies and distorts agency and social justice on the border. For example, the following range of students with Mexican ancestry is common in my sophomore writing class. Students with Mexican ancestry whose families have lived in the United States for many generations. They strongly identify as U.S. Americans and have little to no connection to Mexico. Students whose parents are from Mexico, but they were born in the U.S. and caught between English and Spanish, generation 1-5. Students who were born in Mexico but immigrated early to the U.S. and are learning English writing at home. Students that immigrated recently or commute from Mexico. And there are students who are cross-border Spanish-English bilingual who live and work on both sides of the border. Now, if you go back to this social justice model, it does not have any way of exploring how to improve the social justice of the complexity of the border populations. Here is a human capability approach. And the human capability approach has as its end what people are able to be and do. And it has a series of inputs, and this inputs influences how they can convert the inputs into things that they can do. For example, let's talk about writing in Spanish and writing in English. We will have many students in our composition classrooms who are Spanish dominant or Spanish is their first language, and they're able to function perfectly in Spanish written compositions. But the social arrangements and the infrastructure at the U.S. University does not allow them to write in Spanish in their composition course. The instructors, we don't have enough instructors in English composition that are Spanish bilingual, and our infrastructure in the United States and material conditions and institutions force these students to write in English. The same can be said on the Mexican side. I'm totally fluent writing in English. That has a different context in Mexico, though, and I have a different ability to convert these resources into functionings. We'll continue this discussion of the human capability approach.